Okay. All right. Well, welcome everyone. We are so happy to have you all with us today with this incredible panel that we'll be jumping into here in a second. Per usual, we've all been on the Zooms for some time now, but we do have a few housekeeping items that we want to share before we get started. So we do have live closed caption translation available. So please refer to the banner at the bottom of your Zoom screen to turn on that feature. We ask that you please share in the chat box your name, organization, where are you joining us from today, and if you'd like to add what you are looking forward to in this conversation. I think that will really allow for us to have a fluid conversation this next hour. And then as we chat, of course, please share any questions that you might have for the panelists in the chat box as well. We'll be gathering them to answer at the end of our call today during our Q&A. And I see that we have about half the guests who have joined us, which is fantastic. On behalf of Hispanics in Philanthropy, again, welcome. We are so excited to host a conversation with this incredible slate of philanthropic leaders funding the gender justice movement, especially today on Women's International Day. Across the sector, we have seen their work to fund the movement, defending the rights, opportunities, and well-being of women, girls, and gender-expansive communities. Our partners here today understand how important it is to continue investing in this movement. I'm sure all of you on this call today know that currently less than 1% of all philanthropic funding goes to Latinx serving organizations across the United States. And the numbers get even smaller when you analyze the trends by gender and region. So this conversation is really, it's crucial for all of us. And beyond today's conversation, of course, we invite you to be sure to check out the incredible work of each of our partners. We'll be sharing their information in the chat, so you all have access to that. And throughout this month at HIP, you can also go to our platform, HIP Give, to support our gender equity campaign, Go Mujeres 2023. This campaign has mobilized support and visibility and funding for more than 371 grassroots organizations serving women and girls across 17 countries in the Americas and has raised over $600,000. So please be sure to check out that campaign. And lastly, before we jump in, on this International Women's Day, we wanted, again, to bring together these influential philanthropic leaders to have a really meaningful and transparent conversation about their work and how philanthropy has responded to the waves of challenges that women, girls, and gender nonconforming people continue to face. So with that, I'd love to introduce our fantastic panel today. I'm just going to share their names, organization, and then we'll jump into the questions. So joining us today is Julieta Garibay. Julieta, if you want to maybe just wave at the camera. Julieta is the Senior Co-Director of Capacity Building at Groundswell Fund. Kathy Hall, Director of Equality for Women and Girls at the Summit Foundation. Lori Robinson, Founder and Executive Director of Vida Afro-Latina. Josefina Casati, Senior Director of Communications at Grantmakers for Girls of Color. And then Chantelle Fisher-Borne, Project Director for Out in the South Initiative at Funders for LGBTQ Issues. We will be dropping all their information, but thank you all for joining us today for this conversation. We are so happy to have you with us. And so let's go ahead and let's get started. So each of our panelists today, if you can tell us a little bit more about your organization and how the intersections of race, age, and gender, and other identities impact the work that you do. And we're going to have Julieta kick us off.
All right. Hola, buenos días, buenas tardes. I'm so excited to be here. I'm Julieta. I'm with Groundswell, which is one of the largest funders for women of color-led organizing in the United States, as well as reproductive justice movement. For Groundswell, the people living at the sharpest crosshair of race, class, and gender often have the clearest insight of the systemic oppression in this country and the best solutions for dismantling it. And so for us, it translates to resourcing intersectional grassroots organizing and centering the leadership of women of color, particularly Black, Indigenous, transgender, and gender expansive folks. With a very intentional focus, right, in the US South, Southwest, and Midwest regions, which is where a majority of Black and Brown folks live, as well as usually low-income communities that have been historically told that their issues, their voice, and their vote doesn't matter. And so we strengthened the US movement for reproductive and social justice by investing in intersectional organizing as the most effective at energizing and sustaining grassroots-based support. For Groundswell, the people power is the end game, right? We invest and bolster the people power of directly impacted comunidades, because when our comunidad has the people power to see, feel, and create new laws by us and for us, or de plano, dismantle the existing ones, that's where the power is at. When they're able to build the people power to win the policies, and also to ensure that there's implementation and also protecting those wins that they just gotten. For Groundswell, right, we trust the wisdom of BIPOC, trans, and gender expansive folks about their communities. Our best contribution is providing them with resources, tools, and support to amplify their power as well as their wins. And this equates to us steadily increasing across all of our funds, our investments, which represents our trust in our community leaders, as well as a recognition of what it really takes to do this work, including power building with directly impacted communities, and also coalition building, right? Building that collective power with our relatives in other movements, because we believe that our lives and our liberations are interconnected. You know, with the Dobbs decision, really highlights a moment of choice for all of us. First, naming that this decision has had the biggest impact on women of color and low-income women specifically. However, for us, it's a moment of choice beyond abortion, right? Although some of our well-intentioned advocates might be seeing it as only abortion rights, and not really acknowledging, right, that what we have been saying for years, the attacks that we've seen across the states on abortion, transgender folks, voting rights, to name a few, are entrenched in an injustice system. Because let's be clear, the systems and institutions are working exactly how they were built and created to work, to criminalize and dehumanize nuestras comunidades, right? Black, Indigenous, people of color, transgender, and gender expansive folks. And it's pivotal that in this moment, we see the intersections, because let's be real, the same folks who are pushing for abortion bans and attacks on women and folks of color are the same folks who are criminalizing transgender youth. They're the same folks who are criminalizing transgender folks, the same folks that are pushing for anti-immigrant laws and voter suppression and against criminal race theory, right? And so let's be clear about what's happening in this country. And so this moment, we feel for Groundswell, right, is calling us to protect bodily autonomy. And that means protecting trans, queer communities, fighting for reproductive justice, for voting rights of women, Black women, and Black and Brown communities. Check. I'll pass it to whoever is ready.
Kathy, do you want to go next?
Sure, happy to go next. So just so honored to be here. I work for a 33-year-old family foundation called the Sant Foundation. The Summit Foundation. Our sister foundation is Sant. We're kind of early middle age, I guess you could say. And we're still learning, like many. I was certainly still learning at 33, and I'm still learning in my 50s. Anyway, so our vision is a world where people can thrive and nature can flourish, and a world in which one is not sacrificed for the other. So 2 of our 3 programs are more squarely focused on addressing climate change. One works on accelerating carbon neutrality in US cities while centering equity, and the other works on securing a healthy and resilient Mesoamerican reef system in the coast of Central America. The reason I'm here today, I direct a program called Equality for Women and Girls. Our goal is to support empowerment of women and girls by amplifying their voices, protecting their choices, including their sexual and reproductive health and rights, of course, and ensuring that their human rights are respected by society and the laws that govern them. So we've kind of grounded our work in UN Sustainable Development Goal 5, and that is on gender equality and achieving girls and women's empowerment. And that we know that women everywhere in the world continue to face barriers in achieving gender equity in their educational, reproductive, sexual, economic, broader social lives, political lives. We certainly see and try to reflect in our grant making that these barriers are the highest, whether you're talking about the US or many other places, for Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other women and girls of color, and transgender and non-binary folks. Geographically, we're not a huge foundation, so we focus our grant making mainly in Central America, but we've also begun funding in the US as well. In 2021, our founders had previously done quite a lot of funding including on SRHRJ issues in the DC area, but that transitioned about 7, 8 years ago. So 2021, we got back in the US, which was really exciting for me as an American woman. So we believe, in taking this intersectional approach and really focusing a lot of resources on youth, on young people, adolescents, youth, engagement, and recognizing that confronting the barriers that youth face, of course, intersects with confronting the racist, misogynist, anti-LGBTQ plus social norms that are just so unfortunately prevalent. And the last thing I'd like to say, because I really want to pass it to my co-panelists, we prioritize trying to get our grants to local groups, and that includes making grants to sort of more small and medium-sized organizations, such as those that have graduated from, say, public foundation dockets, like the awesome docket of Groundswell, for example. And yet those groups have ambitions to keep growing, and Groundswell and other funds like those need to look for the new guys. So that's it from me, and I guess back to you, Brenda,
Thank you, Kathy.
Next.
Yes, thank you so much, Kathy. Lori?
Thank you so much. I am so delighted to be here. Thank you so much to HIP for the invitation for Vida Afro-Latina to be present with you all, and just so happy to be with these amazing panelists and learn more about your work. So to fill you in about Vida Afro-Latina, we are an emerging international women's fund. We connect resources with Black and Afro-descendant women-led organizations only in Latin America that are addressing sexual violence. We are a participatory grant maker. We have completed our pilot cohort, our pilot grant cycle, and we have a cohort of 4 organizations that received funding in 2021. And we are right now in the process of dispersing funds to our second cohort of 17 organizations. So we're very excited that we are early stage, but certainly in growth mode. Regarding intersections, clearly the intersection that we focus on is race. And I think it's important to just start with the understanding, and I'm sure many people here know, but some may not, that 95% of Africans kidnapped and brought to the Western Hemisphere during the transatlantic slave trade were brought to Latin America and the Caribbean. In comparison to the United States, only 5% of Africans kidnapped and destined for slavery were brought to the United States. So today, 1/3 of the population of the region is of African descent. We also know that the inequality and the inequity based on race in the Latin American region is quite extreme. And so I don't want to throw a whole lot of statistics at you. I know it's hard in 1 hour to hear a whole lot of numbers, but suffice to say that Black and Afro-descendant people in Latin America are generally out of reach of opportunities for resources, very disconnected from centers of power, marginalized at so many levels within society. And so it's really important for funders to emphasize and connect resources with people of African descent, Black and Afro-descendant people in the United States, and women in particular. So just to explain a bit about why we focus on sexual violence. Sexual violence is often considered a gender justice issue, of course. We recognize also that it is a racial justice issue in the context of the Americas. Women of African descent have been disproportionately victimized since the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade 500 years for obvious reasons to increase human product enslaved labor. And so the stereotypes, the inequities that were created during that time continue to perpetuate disproportionate sexual violence against perpetrated against people of African descent. We know that we've heard the statistic about funding for gender justice movements. We also know that very little funding going into Latin America from global human rights funders, from US foundations, less than 3% are explicitly directed toward people of African descent. So we're really committed to beginning to fill in that gap in funding to, we know that women who are victimized and vulnerable just cannot afford to wait for people with power and money to prioritize their safety and wellness. So we have made a decision that we're focusing on this issue that so often gets overlooked, ignored, swept under the rug because of stigma, because it's so painful, because women continue to move forward to the degree possible, and it's absolutely unacceptable. So we're really excited to be able to partner with grassroots organizations, most of which have never before received funding from a philanthropic organization. And we're excited also to grow our relationships with peer funders and figure out how we can continue to move money and connect other resources as well to our partners in Latin America. I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much, Lori. And you're absolutely right. We cannot afford, I love what you said, we cannot afford to wait for those with power and money. I'm sure we've all said that in some capacity, but thank you for lifting that back up. All right, Chantelle, and then Josefina, you'll go up after Chantelle.
Hey everybody, good afternoon. My name is Chantelle Fisher-Borne. I use she, her pronouns. And I'm the Senior Project Director for the Out in the South initiative at Funders for LGBTQ Issues. It's a lot of words and a lot of letters. My mom still doesn't know what I do for a living, but she's very proud of me. So I'm in Durham, North Carolina, and my organization is based in, we were based in New York, but now we're totally virtual. And our organization, like HIP, is a philanthropic support organization, or a PSO. We're part of philanthropy's plumbing, but nobody in philanthropy wants to be associated with plumbing, so I don't say that very publicly. But our work is really to help support and organize funders to better support LGBTQ movement work. We're a 40-year-old organization, I think, coming out of an effort of queer and trans people, organizers and activists trying to organize funders to better support the kind of work we desperately need to support the communities that we care about. We do this in two different ways. We do research about funding trends, where money's going, where it's not going, identifying places where we need to organize funders to better support the kind of work that we need. And we do collaborative work. We work with we're a membership organization, and we work with our members to identify, where we need to come together to really challenge philanthropy to do a better job. We understand as an organization that traditional philanthropy is basically white supremacy culture on steroids. We know that, and it inhibits often the work that we need. And so what we do is, through our programmatic work, we support funders to come together and to really practice philanthropy in a different way. Much to the way of Groundswell and Lori's work. I've not met you, Lori, before, but I'm just excited to hear about what you're doing and appreciate the work y'all are doing. And I think for us, two of our main programs are Grantmakers United for Trans Communities and the Out in the South initiative, both of whom really target places that we know are deeply under-resourced and doing some of the most brilliant and creative work. So as far as intersectional sort of work and all that. For us, it's really like, how do we appreciate and push the fact that LGBTQ people, queer and trans people, queer and trans folks of color are part of every community that we care about. And if you're funding human work, social justice work, you are doing LGBTQ work. And how do we really appreciate that queer and trans people, and particularly queer and trans people of color, are providing leadership and vision to every social justice movement around the country and around the world? And the kinds of organizations and groups that are so needed in our communities are so deeply under-resourced and just undervalued by philanthropy. And how do we support what we think of as really what we're doing over the last several years is these experiments of really, when you have aligned funders, well, how can we move money in a way that is really aligned with what movement says it wants and needs? And that to me is the heart of our work. And we've learned so much working with funders who are up for the challenge, who are politically aligned and are able to sort of move money in a way that, you know, honestly, traditional philanthropy says that it can't, but it really can, it just isn't. And so how do we show over and over again, you know, that we can do this and then and right now, honestly, with the current climate around the anti-trans bills around the country, I think just being real that we all have a lot of work to do and just appreciate the ways in which our members and folks on this call are showing up to support trans folks, particularly to support trans kids, and to think about this as decades of work coming at us from, you know, sadly, pretty sophisticated right-wing organizing. And so we can say more about that, but I'm glad to be here today. And yeah, it's good to see all of you.
Thank you, Chantelle. Josefina?
Thank you, Brenda. My video started going off, so hopefully I'll be able to join here. Thank you so much for hosting this panel and opening this conversation on this particular day. I am so happy to join you. I use she, her, ella pronouns, and I am calling you from the traditional lands of the Jumamos, Comanche, and Coahuiltecan people, also known as Austin, Texas. Grantmakers for Girls of Color is the question. To answer your question, how does our work and our organization work at the intersection of race, age, and gender? Everything that we do works exactly along those intersections. Grantmakers for Girls of Color is the primary national philanthropic intermediary working to mobilize resources that support girls, femmes, and gender expansive youth of color and follow their leadership and their brilliance. Because we recognize that they just happen to be living at the intersection of all these three areas: race, gender, but additionally age. We recognize also that all social justice movements, climate justice, economic justice, gender justice, are all led by and directly impact girls of color. We also very deeply recognize that they are worthy of investment, protection, and care. And we know also that by ceding power to girls, femmes, and gender expansive youth of color, we are co-writing a revolutionary love story with them through philanthropy. I see Larry smiling at that. Our mission is very aligned with what everyone here is saying, but our particular mission is to resource and support transformative organizing work that dismantles systems of oppression across the U.S. and U.S. territories. And it's founded on an infrastructure that reflects our values of culture partnership, healing, reciprocity, and love. We do all this recognizing how important language is and how language matters. Also to specify that when we refer to girls of color, we include any cis, trans, gender expansive, non-binary, and or any girl or femme identified person age 25 and younger who identifies as Black, Indigenous, Latina, Asian, Arab, Pacific Islander, and or other people of color. And it's wonderful to be here and have this conversation and have this allyship growth with all of you.
No, thank you so much, Josefina, and the rest of the panelists. A lot of beautiful things were said. I think what really resonated with me, I think Julieta, you said, our lives and liberation are interconnected, and all of this work is so intersectional. And Josefina, I love that at the end you brought in love, because I know a lot of this, it's a labor of love for so many of us, and I'm sure all of our participants. So thank you all for sharing about your organizations and a little bit more about your work. So shifting gears a little bit here, over the last 3 years, we all know, we have all witnessed a gender justice movement that has been consistently under attack, right, on a global scale. Even earlier this year, the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres declared a regression in the path toward gender equity. In the last 3 years, women, girls, gender nonconforming people have disproportionately faced just compounding public health crises, policies that have chipped away at their rights and increased hate and violence. And, at HIP, my personal perspective, HIP's perspective, it really comes down to that philanthropy has the power, not only the power, but truly the responsibility to invest our resources into our leaders who are working so hard, within this movement. And I know many of us wish we could do so much more in order to achieve gender equity and really, true justice. But in that spirit of self-reflection, I want to invite you all to share a little bit more about what it would take for philanthropy, within philanthropy, to catalyze this transformation. So the question to all of you is, what challenges do you think philanthropy has to face in order to advance the gender justice movement? And Lori, I'm going to have you kick us off.
Thank you for that question. And just to add a little context in terms of the communities that we partner with, in Brazil, the former president slashed resources for addressing gender-based violence by 90% between 2020 and 2022. So as you said, this is a global phenomenon that we're experiencing. So I think that philanthropy, first of all, has to acknowledge its own roots and start from scratch. Just really understand that, where did all of this money come from that corporations have, that families have, and that they've amassed over centuries. And I think we should, as a sector, understand our role as returning resources and power extracted from communities over centuries back to those communities, that this should really be considered a process of holistic and restorative justice, as opposed to altruistic giving. Or, obviously there's a shift afoot in philanthropy to do more unrestricted grant making, more trust-based grant making. But as a new funder, we were created with a participatory model, but from what I hear, many funders are just struggling with the idea of trusting their partners. So I think starting with some really deep sector-wide reflection and just being willing to give up some power and understand ourselves differently is going to be key.
You see me over here agreeing, Lori, I forgot I had to call on somebody. I'm like, yes, yes, yes. All right, Kathy.
Oh, thanks, Brenda. It's hard to follow Lori's really insightful and accurate characterization of philanthropy. I guess what I would add is that, this is a long fight that we're in, and there will be setbacks. I mean, the Secretary General noted we're in a kind of setback. We're trying to work toward these sustainable development goals globally, including in our own country, the US, where there are many shortfalls in trying to get even close to them. So it's a long game. And I feel like many philanthropic institutions, have a lot of impatience with, they have impatience, which can be a good thing, but it's not directed in a productive way toward the grantee organizations that they support. There's often times a sort of failure to recognize that, as Lori was saying, unrestricted and longer term support is what's needed to help fuel the sector, to help fuel the activists and, the folks that are doing this work on the ground locally. there are good and bad reasons for foundations to sort of support grantees for a long time. We tend to do that. I mean, the flip side of that is if our budget isn't growing, we can't add new groups, right? But I guess the last point I just want to make is that we all have to resist the sort of, I mean, particularly larger philanthropic institutions need to keep looking for new organizations, new activists, and figuring out how to fund them. Even if like we can't write the check, there are ways that we're privileged. I mean, I'm privileged to have a position where I'm supposed to be trying to figure out how to sort of fund those that merit funding. And even if it has to be a more creative way to do that than like a grant, because again, sometimes private foundations have legal restrictions. So what else can we do? Who can we connect them to? Which of you, like these awesome funds of those on the call might be able to help, or a fiscal sponsor, or a fellowship from some institution. Like how can we get resources? So anyway, that's where my mind is like just this is the long game, and we have to keep thinking about those that need to come up. Like, again, we have a youth emphasis for that very reason. Like we need to be, making sure resources are reaching those that are in, that are coming up in age and are like whether they're 10 years old or 22 years old, they also need to be supported. It's not just the mature leaders. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kathy. Chantelle, you want to answer this question next?
Yeah, sure. I think just to build, I think some of the challenges are just like you have sort of a spectrum of like on one end, traditional philanthropy, like benevolent, giver, kiss my ring kind of dynamic. And then you have like reparations on the other end. There's a lot of different, it's one way to think about it. I think there are institutions and individuals within institutions that sit on different spectrums of that. And then how do we help even folks who have even like a left or reparations frame move money well? There's an interesting, so I think there's a challenge in philanthropy to be honest about where your institution is in that spectrum. And then I think to be honest that philanthropy can fuel movement dysfunction with the ways that they fund movement. And so there's a way to just be more real about how do we authentically support movement to determine what it needs, wants, and have money moving in that direction versus, funders deciding what movement need and wants. And so there's and some of that is participatory grant making for sure. But I think that there is just a challenge around the power dynamic and who's deciding things. And then how do you just be honest that traditional philanthropy really inhibits the type of work that we need? And it kind of waters the wrong plants, what I'm saying? I think, I'm trying to use the right metaphor, but like, there's also like that Maurice Mitchell article about building resilient organizations, that's moving around a lot. That's just one example but I think there's actually a supplemental article to be written from the funder perspective about how funder practices encourage that dysfunction. So, what I'm saying? So there's some ways to just be real about like how that's some of the challenge of like honesty, an honest take on the role that philanthropy has been playing, and how do we really have a sobering take on that? So,
Yeah, thank you. I mean, a lot of this is it's deeply rooted, right? I mean, earlier someone said, it's centuries in the making. It's deeply rooted in the money. It's deeply rooted in the organizations. I mean, there's so much collective work that needs to happen to really unravel. And I think someone said, let's just scratch it, start fresh, which I think a lot of us would like to see, but that in practice might be a little challenging, but maybe that'll be the next webinar. How do we do that? So next, Julieta, would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you, Brenda. I'm piggybacking on a lot of what has been said, right? But like, let's step back and let's have the real conversation about the history of this country, right? 400 plus years ago, the first ship of 20 enslaved Africans arrived here in the US. And that moment has continued to shape this country, right? For the past 400 years, white supremacy has bolstered the people in power. They provided the ability to strategically invest in their commitment to having decision-making power over Black and brown folks. Through legislation, policing, courts, mobilizing their folks to vote, just to name a few things, right? And also we need to acknowledge, right, for the past 50 years, the opposition has also very intentionally invested in campaigns to control the reproductive freedom and bodily autonomy of Black and Brown and LGBTQ communities. And then fast forward to the moment that we're in, the realities of post-Roe are not new to BIPOC, women of color, trans and gender expansive communities, right? These communities have been preparing and organizing, fighting against abortion bans, fighting against the injustices at their local level. And so if we were to invest in repro justice movement as robustly as our opposition, we have the people on our side, we have the people power to win it, but it will take more than only funding single programs, right? Philanthropy must fund intersectional grassroots organizing led by Black, Indigenous, women of color, transgender and gender expansive folks. And so I feel the question and the challenge for us as funders, right, is will 1 year grant or one project grant only will really make a dent on the centuries of oppression our communities have been surviving through, right? Are we willing to step up to the plate to invest in our comunidades with multi-year grants, offering general operating support, and without the litany of requirements and obstacles that we usually have as funders, right? Are we really willing to step up to the plate to fund for the true liberation of our comunidad? I feel like that's the question. Check.
Yeah, thank you, Julieta. Josefina.
Thank you, Brenda. Same, I echo everything everyone is saying. I think that the racialized and gender notions of who philanthropy can trust with their dollars really comes, that's it, it's trust. Who do they trust? If there was something that I could shift is helping restructure philanthropy to recognize that the communities that they are aiming or trying to serve have all of the wisdom and insight to serve themselves. And we need to trust them by abundantly resourcing them to be able to mobilize in the ways that they need to mobilize to make the shifts, to continue to make the important work, because they're already doing this work. And we just need to recognize that and fund it abundantly. That's the key here, right? I would challenge philanthropy to really reach those who have been historically underrepresented and then take the responsibility and make the steps towards change. And that change looks like assessing their own teams and identifying how much representation and input they have within their teams, how much representation and input they have from the communities they are aiming or thinking about serving, and then being very intentional with opportunities that really reach those communities. That's something that I would do if I could. If I had a magic wand, this is one of the first things I would do. Something that I hear often is we want to change, our approach is shifting, our values, we recognize there's a problem, we want to fix it, but we don't know how to reach those communities. I would invite philanthropy to really be more collaborative and recognize that there are intermediaries, many represented here, who are in immediate and deep contact with those communities. So work with them to move monies and allow us to move those monies to those communities. Those are some of the changes that I would make.
Thank you, Josefina, and thank you, everyone, for being really candid and transparent around this question. I do see, before I ask my final question, there is a chat question. I'd be curious to hear panelists' thoughts on giving to individuals as a different approach. So why don't we answer that question as a collective? And let's start with Chantelle.
Giving to individuals, is that the question?
So let's see. I'd be curious to hear panelists' thoughts on giving to individuals as a different approach. So it's an anonymous attendee, and okay. The way that I think what it's trying to say here is instead of going through like funding an organization, like what if we just gave to individuals?
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, Chantelle. If that is not the question that this, our guest wanted us to answer, please let us know. Okay. So what are more radical ways to transfer and give up power and funding to those on the ground. Often participatory grant making is lifted up as a solution for the systemic power structures that are feeding the dysfunction. But it is also common for participatory grant making to be a lot of theater while some power dynamics are still in place.
Yeah.
A little more context.
That's a great question. So I think that is a great way to answer maybe both the questions. I think, yes, I think there is a way to be more creative and flexible, that often foundations can sort of use tax law, for example, as a reason for not being able to do a thing that movement wants to do, but really it actually is true. So I think, so I would just lift up a couple, there's different models to think about. Like, for example, moving money to individual people, of course, is possible and real. And there's also things you got to figure out, who's deciding who, which, all the things. But I think there are a couple models that I wanted to lift up. The Southern Power Fund is one of our grantees at the Out in the South Fund that has been really an intervention on philanthropy to show how flexible and quickly money can move into organizations that typically aren't on the radar of funders. So funders, some organizations of the Southern Power Fund using their standing with existing funders to move money to great work. One example, the North Carolina Collaborative for Strong Latinx Communities is a great statewide work. So I think looking at those models is a great way. And then the Contigo Fund is the only queer and trans Latinx participatory fund in the South. And I think I appreciate the challenges sometimes with participatory grant making, but I think there's a way to bring people into a different posture around it, where you don't coach them into being gatekeepers or creating just another traditional philanthropic gatekeeping structure, but more of a movement conversation about how do we support the work that we know we all need. So there's a different way to sort of approach the participatory grant making, so where you're not creating just like a mini traditional philanthropy gatekeeping situation. So I think so I would think just like some of these models are really powerful and helpful just to look at in terms of like how to increase scale. That's part of what we do through our work, is just trying out some of these different models that want to practice this in the certain way and see how far we can go and what we can learn together. So I hope that helps with the money to individuals, as well as the last question, Brenda. I'm trying to make them both work because we're looking at time. But yeah, that's what I would say to that.
Thank you, Chantelle. So actually, I think we have a couple of questions coming in, and I do want to get to our last question, but I'd like for our panelists to maybe answer this next one, and then we'll come back to our list. Okay, so this one is a little bit more on. Let's see. Do you all as funders know any organizations that would provide, let's see, coordination of technical assistance needs in addition to grants for grantees? For example, like to really coordinate between foundations and contracts that provide monthly hours to the general operatings of these organizations. So we've been talking a lot about, and this is a little bit more of a tactical, like organizational, like operational question, but I'm wondering, as we're talking about what it's going to take to really invest in the organizations that are doing the work, all of us in the nonprofit space understand that it's multifaceted, that the support needs to look very holistic, that it needs to be, trust-based. It's a very unique approach. So I'm wondering if any of our panelists, if just one of you wants to answer that question, and I could drop it in the chat so you can get a little bit more information, but it's really like, do your organizations, or do you know of any that would provide this coordination of technical assistance, to really move this forward more holistically?
I can jump in. So part of our work with other funders, right? It's also organizing other funders. And so we work through FATE, which is a majority of IB funders, sorry. But some of the work that we've been doing, for example, at the end of the last year, many of our folks were sharing how they needed more cybersecurity and physical security as they were doing work on the ground. And so we came together and said, okay, how do we respond to this need, right? And so FATE was able to coordinate with Vision Change Win to to then provide some of the trainings. I'm really thinking like, okay, one training is not going to do the thing, right? And so how do we do ongoing trainings, specifically right now with the partnership with Vision Change Win, to really be able to respond to the needs of grantees. And then on the Grantswell side, right, the capacity building work that we do, we really focus on like, it's very multi-pronged approach, right? So they get grants, they also get coaching, yearly coaching, as well as TA support. And that also includes org development, because we know like the organization is not only organizing to get out the vote, right, or like to make sure that folks are organized, but we're looking at the bigger picture of like, how is the organization really going to be able to sustain themselves and for the long-term run. And so that's a good example, Faith, I feel.
Great. Thank you so much, Julieta. All right, so we have one final question for all of our panelists, and then we'll have likely time for one more Q&A, and then our panelists are going to leave you all with a call to action and also how you can continue engaging with them. So we've got about 12 minutes left. Thank you all for your very thoughtful questions coming in. So this last question is a little bit of a two-part for our panelists. So from the first part is like from your perspective, and we've covered this a little bit, but really rooted in the gender equity movement. From your perspective, what can philanthropy do to support the movement more effectively? So we're talking narrative change, grant making, investing in individuals, right? We're talking about the full scope of what can philanthropy do when it comes to the gender equity movement to move it forward more effectively. And if you all could maybe provide one example of how you feel your organization has done that really well, and it could be a project you're super proud of, it could be a grant that you recently awarded, it could be different ways in which the movement is being impacted. So let's start with Josefina.
Thank you, Brenda. I'm trying to see some of the questions coming in and listening to. The question that you're asking now is how can philanthropy fully fund the gender movement?
How can philanthropy support the gender equity movement? And we're talking, the full scope of all that funders can support, all the collaborations that can happen, with partners. We're talking narrative change, partnerships, funding, of course, is a huge component, but really the full scope.
My immediate answer is just that funding. If we just look at the amounts that are distributed to women-led organizations, to organizations that support and resource all of the issues that directly impact women, which actually impact all of us, they're not just women's issues. But if we look at the amount of money that is actually being distributed, that's where it starts. There is such control and such closed doors in so many aspects that I think that is the primary way that we can begin to make actual shifts and changes, is by committing to funding organizations that are supporting all of the issues that affect women's issues, but all of our issues. Of course, that is the foundation of Grantmakers for Girls of Color, is focusing specifically on all of the various projects. We do a multitude of things, collaborating, partnerships. We have partnerships included with some of the folks in this space here. And all of our different funds support various aspects. We have holding a sister initiative, which is for trans girls of color. We have the New Science Rising initiative, which is for Indigenous girls across the US and territories. And then our Love is Healing is our primary grant. But Black Girl Freedom Fund is a very strong fund that we have right now. I will share our website with it here right now, because we currently have a call to action or asking for applications for grants, specifically for Black Girl Freedom Fund. That includes all of the Afro-Latina organizations. And there's a really exciting specific thing. There was some questions asked about youth. One of the part of this fund is we have youth-led projects that we are funding. This is something new. So again, by youth is 25 and under. So there's multitude of things that can happen, but I think the primary prominent one is funding adequately and abundantly.
Thank you, Josefina. All right, Chantelle.
Yeah, I think that we can really try to lift up models. I think particularly in this current crisis about how funders can just behave differently. And I think there's a way to look at, I appreciate Trans Justice Funding Project being lifted up in the chat as a fantastic participatory model that really invites people into a movement building mindset and resists traditional philanthropic mindset. I think Black Trans Fund, which is housed at Groundswell, is a great another model that folks can look to. And even if you're not set up to in your own institution to be able to do these things, you can partner with other funders. And you can look at the types of organizations that these groups are supporting and figure out if you have the machinery to even support these types of organizations. The last thing I'll say is the Trans Futures Funding Campaign is we don't have a website yet, but it's basically right now our urgent call to action for folks to really respond to the current crisis, both in terms of urgent need, but also longstanding infrastructure needs for groups on the ground in places that are hardest hit. Very similar to all the work everybody here on this call is doing. So just appreciate, I'm seeing so many overlaps and just appreciate all of you doing all the good work out there. So yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, thank you, Chantelle. Kathy?
I guess I would just lift up, I'm repeating my colleagues here, but funding for youth, for young people, that as one person in the chat said, so much are already part of these fights around, gender equity and justice. And so, the ones that come to my mind that I have felt have been really important in our portfolio are Third Wave Fund in the US, the Central America and Mexico Youth Fund that focuses where its name suggests, and then an initiative we're doing that is called the Yield Hub, which is focused on sort of improving how partnerships happen to address adolescent and youth sexual and reproductive health rights around the world. And so anyway, those are efforts. I mean, there's so many great initiatives out there, but I just feel like, again, that abundant funding for initiatives that are centering young people in particular, to be sure that activism is building. And again, we're talking about a long game. So I just feel that that's a priority that certainly I try to center. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Kathy. So folks, I know we have about 7 minutes left, and we definitely want our panelists to provide, call to action and any final thoughts. So Julieta and Lori, we're going to shift a little bit to that, and then we'll come back to the other three. Let's go with Lori. So Lori, if you can share with us, any last thoughts that you have on all the conversations that have been had today. And then if you want to leave our guests with any calls to action, any ways that they can engage with you, with your organization, or in any other areas of the work that you're doing.
Thank you so much. So I'm just thinking about this last question: how can philanthropy support gender equity movements? And I think this goes without saying, but it can't hurt to repeat it, is really, really, really listen to our partners. Keep asking the question, how can we best partner with you? What do you really need in this moment? Because 3 months ago, it might have been different from what they realize is needed now. So we're at the beginning of creating everything, but particularly our capacity strengthening or accompaniment work. And so we're talking to our partners about how can we partner around this aspect of what you all want to accomplish and change. And one thing that we're hearing is we need to learn each other's language. The Brazilians are saying we need to learn Spanish. The Spanish speakers are saying we need to learn Portuguese. Everybody's saying we need to learn English. So we're thinking seriously about, can we create some infrastructure for our movements to be able to communicate with each other? So that seems to me a bit outside of what philanthropy might think of as our work. So listening to movements and really being open to doing things differently. In terms of a call to action, we don't have any specific grant opportunities coming up at the moment, but I would just encourage folks to check out our website, to check out our launch report, which explains our origin story, and reach out to us, sign up for our newsletter. We're definitely open to opportunities to partner and think about new ways that we can work together to collaborate with communities in Latin America.
Thank you so much, Lori. Julieta?
Yeah, we must follow the leadership of women of color and low-income women, transgender and gender expansive folks. They have the clearest vision of what it will take for us to win. They're doing the work and they need the abundant funding. And so as one of the largest funders for the RJ movement, Groundswell can help identify where their infrastructure already exists and how to fund it. And so we're here to also help, right? And I think I want to challenge us, right, to go beyond partnership and to conspire, because that's what our communities need.
I'll just give you some snaps, Julieta. Conspire, yes. All right, let's see. Kathy.
I'm taking 30 seconds only to say that it is an imperative for funders of whatever type, private foundations, public foundations, et cetera, and also, you know, organizations and activists to both call each other to provide connections to help, like, in other words, the local groups need to, even if a funder says it's not possible for us to fund you right now, you know, Groundswell says, we're so sorry, we can't fit you in this year. It's up to the local group to say, what connection might you be able to give me? And then it's up to certainly any donor of shape size to do the same, like offer that. So that's my call to action to all of us. Ask for what you should expect, and for the funders, do it. Give something, whatever it might be realistic at that moment.
Thank you, Kathy. Just gonna keep snapping away the rest of the webinar. All right, so Josefina and then Chantelle, if you want to close us out.
Thank you, Brenda. I want to lift up Cecilia Sáenz Becerra's calling on language justice. You know, the reality is that if you don't speak English, a lot of philanthropy is out of access to you. But I'm also echoing what Julieta said and what Lori said and what everyone has said is, my call to action would be for us to continue to come together and collaborate with each other, to support each other's movements and causes and projects, and sign up for each other's newsletters, and really build a stronger movement, because we're just beginning to make the changes that are necessary. And together we are so much stronger. Thank you for this opportunity, and let's do more of them.
Chantelle?
Yeah, I'll just echo, I think we're all saying similar things about how do we just make sure we're solving the right problems. And I think problem solving together and being honest about what we can and can't do. And just, I think that's where I have a lot more reverence for places where we're actually being real about where resources are needed, where we can really experiment to move them better, and just having a real, and it takes time. It takes relationships. And I hope for all of us, we can find those spaces where we can build those partnerships and relationships and do some work together. So reach out to us. I'd let me know. We have some great projects moving, but like, just, I hope for all of us that we all have teams of people that we can really honestly problem solve with and figure some of this stuff out, because we all have a lot of work to do. So it's great to hear. I'm inspired today. So thanks, everybody.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us, all of our guests. We're so happy that you were able to, meet our panelists, hear from them, and thank you for your thoughtful questions. To our panelists, thank you for your work. Thank you for, your labor of love, your expertise, and really being willing to, join us today and move forward this work. I kept hearing this is going to take all of us. It's a collective liberation will take every single one of us and then some. So thank you all. We'll be sharing the recording. Please check out all of these wonderful organizations. And just a reminder, we do have the Go Mujeres campaign, so help us support organizations all throughout the Americas working on gender equity. But thank you all. Have a beautiful day, and we look forward to connecting again soon. Thank you.